Hi there. Welcome to another presentation of the Globe Sound Healing Conference. Now we have Krista Holland. Hi, Krista.
Hi, David.
Krista is a founder of the Sacred Drumming Academy and faculty member of the Shift Network. And she's a multifaceted teacher, historian of the sacred drum, and ceremonialist, specializing in the myth and playing techniques of frame drumming and the living arts of yoga and permaculture. What have you been up to lately?
Well, I've been up to music, drumming, holding circles, raising a young man into the world, and connecting with community.
Nice. Okay, so here's the big question. If you had all the money in the world, what would you do to help people on the planet?
Wow, yes. Well, what comes to mind and to heart is replanting Gaia's global gardens. I'm a plants person, and I feel like the plants really bring so much. So envisioning micro loans, especially to wisdom holders and indigenous cultures around the world, and helping to facilitate thriving indigenous culture really in any way I could support and help them in the stewarding of also the elementals of the waterways, of the soil, of the air, of space, even of fire. I feel so much reverence and honor for the indigenous wisdom keepers around the world, and I feel like that would be where I would want to steward any kinds of abundance and money, and also into the land back movement, so that large swaths of land and forest can be back in the hands of indigenous wisdom keepers. And I think that that would be something that I would love to see come into fruition. The replanting of Gaia's global gardens and the forests and the medicinal plants and medicines, for a starter.
Nice, nice, excellent, beautiful. So tell us about the drum.
Yes, the drum. So much to say about the drum. You can see kind of arrayed around me all of these frame drums. And a frame drum is really a large umbrella term for many different styles of drum that basically have a diameter of the skin larger than the depth of the shell. And frame drums go back many, many thousands of years. Some might be familiar with shamanic drumming, where there is a crossbar on the back and the drum is played with a beater. In this style of frame drumming, it's an open back and played with the bare hands, and this is the style that I specialize in, both in studying the ancient history, the polycultural art and history of the frame drum, and also the playing techniques and some of the modern research on how drumming affects human consciousness. So drumming is really considered by many anthropologists and musicologists to be one of the primary technologies for transforming consciousness. There's something about rhythm, and in fact there's many things about rhythm that can affect us physiologically, can affect us, of course, mentally, sometimes emotionally, spiritually. We have this incredible polycultural history of humans using drums in many different settings and for many different reasons. And that's part of what I study and share and teach, is about the different ways that humans have used drumming in different cultural contexts. And so there's a lot we could say about how drums have been used in ceremony, in ritual, in rites of passage, in different celebrations, in the transforming of consciousness, and creating different state changes, both in trance drumming and ecstatic rituals of celebration, all the way from the Middle East throughout the Mediterranean, through Greece, and drums travel really everywhere across the globe. It's believed that really almost every culture creates a drum, and a frame drum is a primary drum that people create, especially given its simplicity, given that you just need some wood and skin, and also the portability of the frame drum. It's one of the reasons why the frame drum has traveled so far and wide, and there's an incredible migration path, though the actual footprints of the drum's travels in human hands have degraded, in a sense, from the archaeological record. So there's a lot of mystery behind the history of frame drumming, but it is really a huge subject. I think of it almost on par, well, humor me a little bit, maybe not quite on par with the study of yoga, which we know is such a huge art and science. The difference is that a lot of the indigenous and traditional drumming traditions were oral traditions, and they were handed down from mouth to ear and hand to ear, and there isn't as much written down about drumming, but it's coming more into the collective consciousness. It's coming more into the fore. And my teacher, my primary teacher, was a woman named Lane Redmond, the late Lane Redmond, and she wrote a book on the subject titled When the Drummers Were Women, and it gives the history of women drummers, which is actually a very huge, widespread history. But of course, drumming includes all people of really all walks of life and many, many different cultures. So that's a bit about frame drumming.
Well, a lot of it, I mean, you could get into all the different types of drums and such, and you categorize the two main types, but a lot of it is really the rhythm, the type of rhythms you do, right? So when I teach some basic frame drumming in my classes, and this is as far as I go, and you can blast off from here. What I do is I say, just do a stable rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. And you will entrain that person into that stable, consistent rhythm, which is peace. Right? The eardrum is connected to the vagus nerve that goes to all organs in the body. So we are automatically entrained into any sound, especially rhythms around us. We're not meant to live in the city, right? And so it's a direct connection that bypasses the brain. The brain can completely mess it all up, right? It goes straight to the organs. So it's really profound, and it synchronizes your brain with that rhythm, normally with even 30 seconds, and then your heart starts going to alignment. So it's really powerful. And then what I do, well, I'll tell you more about what I do in a bit. So that's the main thing I tell people is just get something basic going and make it stable. Because I've been to shamanic rituals where they'll just play like around 4.5 cycles per second for like a half hour. Same thing, do, 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 do. And people, I mean, I've been at events where I went out of my body and found all of my guides and became a few different animals. I was flying around the room, right? Right? So if you were to give an overview of how to expand on rhythms and sounds, because there's the sounds of the drums and there's a rhythm, how would you go from here?
Well, I would go back really to the beginning. I would begin with gestating to heartbeat, gestating to mother's heartbeat. So it's so primal, it's so primary. And to think that every single human being on planet Earth gestated to bump, 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 or whatever, you know, the valves of the heart creating this rhythmic entrainment, and also the sound of the blood flow throughout the body. So of course that auditory sonic sensibility really develops while we're in the womb as such a primary way of us interfacing with reality. So this idea that each human gestates to rhythm. And my teacher used to tell a story about how when a woman is an embryo, she develops all of the eggs that she'll ever have. So it really actually takes us even deeper into the realization that we also, as humans, gestate in a sense to grandmother's heartbeat, because we are in egg form, right, pulsing inside of mother's womb when she is an embryo inside of grandmother's womb. So we're embedded and we are really born in rhythm, and rhythm is an organizing principle. And there is an idea that the rhythm actually also helps us develop as a baby in the womb. And then we come out and are embedded in the rhythmic cycles of nature and creation. So we look at rhythm in the microcosm of that embryonic pulsation that we each gestate to. And I love the universality of that, because it's something that each one of us experience, no matter where we were born or what culture we were born into, being born in rhythm. And then as we come into our early years, whether we're aware of it or not consciously, we are embedded in these macro rhythms, the cosmological rhythms, of course, day to night, the circadian rhythms, the seasonal rhythms, the diurnal rhythms. And if we start to track nature, we are looking at the patterns of migration and these rhythmic cycles that we go through, and even the great epic eras of time and the epochs. So we can start out, in that small micro rhythm and being aware of those micro rhythms all the way into the macro rhythms. And it's one of the things that drumming echoes, in a sense. It echoes mother's heartbeat, and it could be why so many people feel an aptitude or an interest, or maybe are caught in a moment of recognition when we hear rhythm. And then, as you said, rhythm is also affecting us physiologically. We have that rhythmic entrainment or rhythmic induction. And you mentioned the cityscape. I mean, even the sound of, trains going by and jackhammers and things like that. It's like so much of life really is rhythmic. Even as we walk, right? We're walking rhythmically. Oftentimes we're talking rhythmically. I loved what you mentioned also about the shamanic induction and how that shifts the brain waves. And of course, as you mentioned, the vagus nerve, that's a really important piece. I loved this idea of the vibration of the organs themselves. But another really interesting part is this idea that drumming or rhythmic induction can immediately, or after a little bit of time, right, on holding that steady repetition of rhythm, that has the potentiality to take us from a beta brainwave to an alpha brainwave, maybe down into a theta wave, which many associate with a shamanic state of mind, where we start to be open to different realms of information and realms of being. You mentioned the animal realm, which of course is very classical in shamanism. And though that's not really my area of expertise, I am really sharing and studying and teaching about this idea of sacred drumming, which is a little bit of a different approach, still under this great umbrella of drumming and of rhythm. But this idea that we can shift brain waves with an external implement, such as drumming, is just such a powerful way into both the ancient, the indigenous, the primal use of drums and drumming, but also the modern research that is pointing towards physiological and neurological state change through rhythmic entrainment.
Nice. So I live out in the national park, and for the first year or so, I just watched the birds and saw all the animals in nature. We have oh my God, I live out in the ocean at the lighthouse. And so there's a full range of birds and all the different animals, fox and, coyote and such. And then after a couple of years, I started really being part of the nature. And now, whenever any bird flies by, I notice their rhythm and I sing their rhythm to them. And they fly by and they look at me like, oh, that's Dave singing in the road. Whoa, 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 whoa. Right. And it's so, I'm so aware. I mean, the pelicans are like, whoa, whoa, right? Whereas the seagulls are whoop, 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 right? And then the little Tweety birds are like, right? And so I've really started to sink into the rhythms. But there's a thing that I do that is really amazing, and that is for 10 years, I've been finding a person's metabolism where they're at peace. Mm. And I do it where I play each of the 12 notes and rhythms, because rhythms are actually notes octavized down. If you cut for example, just so people know, if you have 2 cycles per second, 2 beats per second, bum, 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 and you double that, it's the same note. So 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 is a note of C. So that rhythm of 2 cycles per second is a C. So I look at people and I play each of the 12 notes and rhythms and see which one makes them the most peaceful. So I've gotten really good at it. You're very close to mine, which is a B rhythm, which is about whoa, 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 no, 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 right? And people that are slower metabolisms are a little more heavy set, not always, because of hormones, or faster metabolism are a little more thin. You have to average out the heart to get the actual rate, but when you average out the heart up as it goes up and down, it's an exact octave of the brainwave and the breath when you're at peace. And so it's really interesting, because it's like one other thing that's really interesting is when you see somebody, the first thing you see is how scattered or stable they are, right? A little too much coffee, spiritual leader. And the second thing you see is how fast they move, how fast they talk, how fast they walk, and how fast they blink, everything, right? And we all feel it, but we often aren't conscious of it. And and that rhythm of you is just the best for physical health, mental health, and emotional health, and it's a portal to other dimensions where you're one with the universe. When you're in theta, you are, or when you're one with the universe in unity consciousness, you are in that theta rhythm, but to your own theta rhythm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about people's rhythms. It reminds me also of Ayurveda, the sister science to yoga, and how people are naturally have a constitution that might be slower and heavier, and that's very natural for them, or quicker and lighter, or a little more like hot-headed, so to speak. And there's rhythms embedded in that information as well. And when we study and practice the frame drum, when we learn in this tradition, we are learning the rhythms connected to the elements. So we have an earth stroke, we've got a water stroke, fire stroke, air, and space. And that whole tradition came from a Nubian drummer who you might be familiar with, Hamza El-Din. He has the distinction of just bringing some beautiful music to the West, and also playing with the Grateful Dead at the Giza pyramids back in the day. But he shared that tradition with my teacher, and she shared it with us. And there's something alchemical that happens with that, and we can use it in a sense, and take this little bit with a grain of salt, but to remedy our rhythm and our rhythmic signature through drummings. So for instance, if somebody is feeling a little lethargic and might need more fire, to play at a quicker pace and to work with that high note of the fire strokes on the drum. Or if somebody is needing stress reduction or is working through anxiety, then to work at a slower pace and to work with the earth stroke primarily, and also to really be tuning into the elements while we're drumming. So it's partly the technique and the rhythm and the rhythmic time signature, and it's also sometimes using the mythic imagination, or opening up our imagination, and very specifically in relationship to nature. So if somebody finds themselves in a cityscape and they're feeling a little bit like claustrophobic in that city environment, they can utilize drumming as a way to connect back into nature, to connect with the earth underneath them, even if they're in an apartment, to connect with the waters, to work with some of the rhythms and some of the strokes on the drum that are representing water. So we have our own rhythmic signature, as you say, and I think it's so cool that you are attuned in the way that you are interfacing with the world and people, to look at people rhythmically and to kind of just notice as another way of relating to them and another way of connecting, really. And then also how we can use these tools to shift us into different states of rhythm. And of course, as you mentioned and has been mentioned, this idea of shifting the brain waves for that entrainment and to connect to these other wisdom streams. And also it seems that through just the act of drumming per se for a certain given time, keeping that steady beat, the physiological experience that we can have is something that it's real. Of course, there's metaphor in, maybe taking off on a journey, so to speak. But I'm also very interested for each of us what's literally happening physiologically with the vagus nerve you mentioned, and how when we stimulate vagus nerve, take a few deep rhythmic breaths while we're drumming, how that can help us to alleviate or modulate some of the stress of modern living using these very, very ancient technologies.
Nice. So can you play a little bit of the different elements?
Sure.
Because I'm really curious to see what the different elements would be like on a drum.
Yes. I wonder if the listeners can imagine what element this might be. Pa, earthy, grounded, stable, rooted. The paw stroke, connected to the earth. Everything we associate with the earth. Roots, the ancestral line, the mother line, the father line, the bones of the body, the tailbone, that which is stable and earthy. The paw stroke, many different ways of connecting to earth on the drum. Mainly the earth stroke sticks, solid, stable and rooted, like rocks and mountains, minerals and gems, earthy. And water, water is more open, flowing, fluid. Water is doom. A fire stroke. The higher, sharper, hotter, fiery strokes often found on the rim of the drum, in the air, the wind, like the breath. Reminds us to take a few deep breaths. Reminds us of the wind through the trees and the breeze in the leaves, the air stroke or the wind stroke on the drum. And space, spacious silence. The space between the notes, the space between the beats, the space between the bars and the measures, the space between our words. Space, infinite space. And so that's just a little taste of working with the elements on the drum. We have the earth stroke, the pa, the doom stroke, the water. We have the teka strokes, the fire. We've got the air element that we're invoking or honoring, and we have the space, which will be the silence in the bars and the measures and in the composition or the rhythmic conversation.
Nice. So, how would you teach me to go beyond just stable rhythm? What would be the next step to do something a little more interesting? There's heartbeat and there's stable rhythm. It seems like the two most basic.
Yes. Well, you mentioned earlier also just kind of hearkening back to something about people being rhythmic or arrhythmic. And I think there's value in all of that. Sometimes we think of drumming as being just a very steady, right? But what about when we start to flourish, or when we kind of come in and out of different rhythmic time cycles, or we change our tempo, or we change, from drumming in an 8 to a 7, and all of these kinds of juxtapositions and the polyrhythms. And there's some interesting research about how working outside of something that is really linear or stable, where we start to go maybe very intuitive in the rhythm, and from one moment to the next, someone's just taking those elemental strokes and kind of combining them in a way where they're not even sure what comes next. They're just intuitively drumming. And sometimes when we can't catch what the rhythmic time cycle is, where we might be kind of wondering what comes next, the opposite would be like a 4/4 time, which a lot of Western music is. You can feel that next one of the four coming, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, and it becomes very simplistic, and you can kind of feel when that next cycle is coming. But when we can't feel what the next cycle is coming, and when the rhythm gets very almost, we could say chaotic even, and unknown, mysterious, there is some evidence and whether we have any what kind of studies are on this subject, but that unknown rhythm can actually take us up into the gamma brain waves where we actually don't know what's coming next, and it's not obvious what the next part of the rhythmic time cycle is going to be. And I think that's a really interesting idea for people out there, and maybe you yourself, David, would know more about this idea that there's this area of the brain, an area of the brain waves rather, where we can start to attune to gamma brain waves. And what is that about? And what kind of creative insights do we have when we get up to gamma? So there's a lot we can do with rhythmic time cycles and structure where we start to build on a theme, a simple pattern. If we're working on a very classic rhythm in 8 with 2 3s and a 2, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2. We can start to add on, we can subtract, we can start to subdivide the numbers, we can make an 8 out of a 3 and a 5. We can make an 8 out of a 1 and a 7. Still playing an 8, but it's got a real different feel if I'm making the 8 out of a 1 and a 7. It's a little bit juxtaposed because those are odd numbers that are making an even groove.
So we've got
so much we could play with.
A whole system that one of our previous rhythm instructors taught, where we actually use a circle, and we can divide the circle into any number of dots. And if you divide it into 8, then you can do the 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, or ooh oh ah ooh oh ah ooh oh, right? And you can do it on the body, ooh oh ah ooh oh ah, or boom da, da, right? And we've got full range of vowels and body parts that the kids get to play with. And then after doing very complex rhythms with body percussion, where they're even dropping out beats or doing accents, and then even doing musical intervals on different parts of the rhythm. After a few years where they get really into it, I've had the 3 to 6-year-olds totally doing like unbelievable stuff. Then we connect all the dots on the 8-beat circle and a 10-beat circle, and you get every sacred geometry in the universe from just the 8 and 10 dot circles. And then we go through the meaning of the sacred geometry that they've been tapping on their body for years.
Wow. I want to do that. I want to be in that class.
It was cool too, because I would have them do like 5 spots on the body, ooh, oh, ooh, oh, right? And then I would say, look, here's a flower with 5 petals. And then we do 8 spots on the body, right? Here's a flower with 8 petals. Did you know most flowers have 3, 5, and 8 petals? It's called the Fibonacci curve, and it's based on golden mean.
Absolutely.
And they're like, whoa.
Yes.
Yeah.
The perfect fifth, the golden ratio. And there's so much about that in the ancient history of music and the Pythagorean scales and the different scales that people have used. I love that you're tying in the geometry and the symbolism and the archetype, because there's a whole study of that really is crossing with the frame drum specifically. There's so much about the ancient symbolism, and actually the ancient symbols used to be painted on the head of the drum. And many indigenous cultures and ancient cultures, they would also, of course, paint the drum symbolically. It makes me think of the Sami, the indigenous to Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and areas of the Koa Peninsula. Their sacred drum, some of you might be familiar, is more oval shape for the Sami peoples. And then it's got the crossbar on the back, and sometimes they use a reindeer horn or different implements for creating out that rhythm, beating out that rhythm. But it's also painted with the migration patterns or hunting patterns and things like that on the head of the drum. And also in the ancient days, the drums would be painted either with red ochre or sometimes green vegetation, which was representing the cyclical cycles of nature: birth, growth, fruition, dissolution, death, rebirth. And that whole cycle of that natural cycle was really a lot about what the drum was teaching people. It was teaching that life happens in cycles and spirals. And it can also teach us about rhythmic time, time out of time, and that rhythmic time, as opposed to clock time, which is also rhythmic, or the calendrical system, which we see a calendar in, squares, and oftentimes modern people will relate, in a sense, to the calendar in the square shape. But the ancient and the indigenous were relating to time in a spiral and in a circle. And the drum is reminding us that time happens in a spiral. So there's this whole other way of relating. It's also moon cycles. And the drum was representing the moon. And it was representing women's moon cycles and how women's biology is naturally connected very strongly rhythmically. And if we fall out of rhythm in the modern age and we become arrhythmic, and a woman might not even be really aware of where she is in the cycle, but if we just simply look to the moon and tune into the biology, then we can start to live more rhythmically. And that has all kinds of implications for healthy, balanced living. And so there was many different symbols painted on the drum, and it also was used, of course, as I mentioned, ceremonially, and that also is a teaching in itself. There's many different statues found all over the world, and the statues mainly in the Middle East, in the deserts of the Middle East, where it is a statue, a clay statue of a woman holding a frame drum, and those would be buried with people, and they're found all throughout the deserts of what would have been Mesopotamia, Babylonia, ancient Ugarit, and the ancient area of the Philistine, Palestine, Israel, all throughout the deserts. We find these statues of women with a frame drum or woman with a sacred drum. And that in itself, woman with frame drum, turns out to be a very widespread archetype and symbol that has been created in art for thousands and thousands of years. So that's what the research in the book that my primary teacher wrote, When the Drummers Were Women, it's showing all of the different art that is made of this idea, this, what do I want to say, this motif of a woman with a frame drum. And there's a lot of people still that are just kind of coming to this information that this was so widespread. So part of the teaching in the Sacred Drumming Academy is also looking at the ancient art in different presentations. So we're talking about art from basically 8,000 years ago all the way to the modern era. And this art is from many, many different cultures. And what you'll see again and again is woman with a frame drum. And so we look to the symbolism of what did that mean? Why was the artist and many different artists choosing to paint that motif over and over again? And so we see the clay statuary, we see in the temples of Egypt, especially connected to Hathor and Isis, we'll see women with their frame drums in processional. There's hieroglyphs with a woman with a frame drum that represents to beat a rhythm, but also the concept of joy. It has kind of a double meaning, a double entendre. A woman with a frame drum we know that that means joy. And the frame drums in the Egyptian culture were used not only in the birthing temples of Hathor and the god Bes. He's a small kind of character that holds a frame drum. But the frame drum was also used in the funerary rites. So when a person died, they would have different ceremonies accompanied by frame drumming. It's said that in the embalming process, there would be a 40-day and a 40-night vigil of people drumming with the frame drum in the embalming process. And then if we move into the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of mention of the frame drum, and that specifically is held in the hands of Miriam the prophetess. In the Hebrew Bible, she leads her people in the Exodus with the frame drum, the timbrel, and dancing. And then if we pop over to Turkey, we see the frame drum in the hands of different goddesses in that tradition. And then it starts to move throughout the Middle East into the ancient myths of Inanna and Dumuzi. There is talk of the frame drum that's in the written text. And throughout the Mediterranean, all throughout Greece, there is a huge ancient tradition of women playing the frame drum in the different mystery schools. And it just goes on from there. There's a very deep, rich tradition in southern Italy of drumming. And each culture has really kind of a different reason and different application for the drum. So sometimes the drum is used in pure celebration. It's very prominent in wedding traditions. Makes me think of Georgia below Russia. They have a very powerful drumming tradition that has to do a lot with the weddings. And in Ukraine, their tradition in the Ukraine, they have a drum which has a wood beater on it, and that is often played in the rites of springtime and in the folk music of their tradition. Also in Scotland, there's a tradition of frame drumming that goes back at least 500 years by written record. And a lot of those traditions died out, or sometimes the drum would be forbidden for a certain time in certain areas of the world. So we're talking about a tradition that in some areas is a broken tradition, but that also keeps kind of showing up again, and it will reappear and resurrect. It reminds me of a silver hoard, right? So silver platters that were buried in England, and these platters have engraved pictures of women with frame drums, and those were most likely brought by the Romans during the Roman conquest. These platters etched with a woman with the frame drum. So part of what we're doing in the study of the drum is the technique and the rhythm and learning about different rhythmic time cycles, the elements and things like that, but also about the history and how some of that might be applied for modern people and in the future for different ways of working again with our biology. If someone is feeling anxious, if someone is having stress, if somebody is feeling unsatisfied with everyday living, if they're looking for an avenue for creative self-expression, the drum and learning how to play a musical instrument can be a great avenue. I think of the drum as a complementary tool and an adjunct therapy, if you will. So you can bring the drum into really many different modalities that a person might be looking at to create a more balanced, healthy, holistic lifestyle, and also to help energize and vitalize themselves in this modern era.
we're using it. We have a contract with the largest dementia company in Northern California with 130 patients, and we have the drum there. And it's so cool for them to play it and get into it. And left and right hands is left and right brain synchronization, and they can totally play it, right? And it's so powerful. One thing that's really interesting that I've learned is certain rhythms or tempos can be really difficult for people. I had a class on binaural beats, which were just playing rhythms. Wah, 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 wah. And this one woman in class, she starts bawling. She goes, I can't stand this. It's making me crazy. I can't be in here. She was really fragile and really sensitive. And so we tuned into her intuitively and found her note, which happened to be an A, and we octavized that down below 20 hertz where it became a rhythm and played the rhythm that I was playing in the note of A. And she goes, cool, and was fine the rest of the class. And I've had quite a few people, even in the dementia center, if you play a rhythm that's not there, some people can't handle it. People that are really fragile or in hospitals. So it's really, that I found that really important. There's nothing better than your rhythm.
That's fascinating.
Okay, so if we really want to get higher consciousness, what would you do? And how would you define that, I should say?
How would I define that? I mean, it depends on if we're talking about like reaching for a peak state of high or, just a general kind of well-being. I mean, if you're wanting a peak state of high, drumming can definitely take us there. It's part of the reason why drumming has been used in trance drumming and in rituals all over the world. And I think, of course, it really is simplistic and basic in a way, but not necessarily easy or easily attainable these days, is to be in nature and to be with the elements and to be in holistic community and to be in diversity and in musicality. I think that it really is about music. I think, there's a kindred connection here on that. And oftentimes when we're talking about what do we need as modern people, it oftentimes brings me back to the ancient days and the study of how music really has been a defining factor for us in our evolution. This idea that rhythm and music are organizing principles and that they are really a primary medicine, if you will. I mean, take that with a grain of salt, but a primary way of organizing groups of people together in clan and how we migrated. I mean, all the way back to the cave complexes, which were these original cathedrals, and you can only imagine the amphitheater and the acoustics in the cave complexes, and evidence that we've been making music for at least 40,000 years, if not more, but we put maybe a date on 40,000 because we see the bone flutes that were found, for instance, in Germany and different areas of Europe, these vulture bone or different kinds of bone flutes that still hold a perfect pitch. And there's also a hypothesis, it hasn't been proven out, but on some of the stalactites, there are markings that some anthropologists believe might indicate a rhythmic repetition, basically a drumming inside the cave. So sometimes I use my mythic imagination to imagine, okay, back to the cave complex, back and back. We've got the vulture bone flutes playing and someone's, marking out a rhythm on the stalactite, and the acoustics in there, like a modern day cathedral, an amphitheater, such a powerful sound. And then from that we migrated out in clans, and there is also this hypothesis that I just keep coming back to, that some anthropologists also believe that the musicality was specifically what gave humans an evolutionary advantage and an evolutionary edge. And I think that that's why it's been such a continuum in our human story, this ability to make music and to really be in our musicality, and how profoundly healing it can be. And then all the different genres of music, and how the different genre affects us differently physiologically. And like you say, which is really new information to receive from you today, about having like someone's unique time signature, their unique rhythmic note. And I feel like there's just so much potential here.
So I've got something I want to share with you and see what you think about it, because it's, I wrote the number one selling books in audio recording and producing, and the number one book in sound healing, right? And I've got this concept that I teach, that change over time, what I call a dynamic curve, where it builds up and breaks down, is actually more effective than just stability for sound healing. And that dynamic curve can be volume, it can be tempo, it can be the tonality, just even a different part of the drum that's a little more activating as you build up, right? And so if you go like you can build up, it's kind of, I got, where I got this is from Pink Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
Building up, smoothly building up and breaking it, which is exactly the same in kirtan, right? And so if you go dum bum 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 bum, it's way more effective than if you just did a slow breath.
Going back to getting high, I think you just found the formula. One of the formulas, right?
There's another thing that's really interesting. I've always wondered, they say that 4.5 cycles per second, which is about bump, 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 is the trance drum that takes you into different realms. And even I've talked to, even Jeffrey Thompson, who's the master of brainwaves, he doesn't even know the answer. I would think that trance, where you go into another dimension, is a little bit different for each person.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yes, and it also is oftentimes in cultural context for people,
Mm.
right? Like if you grew up in a certain culture where there's certain kinds of animisms, and even the the environment and the ecology, oftentimes with people go into a trance, it will often include representations from their cultural context. I just think it's kind of an interesting, and that could just be coming from the subconscious impressions and the unconscious impressions that are laid down in there somewhere. And then with that rhythmic induction, some of those impressions might rise to the surface. I mean, I don't have the basis on it, that's hypothesis, but I think I love this idea of cultural context, because I feel like the drum can be placed into a cultural context, and I think it should be. I think it can also break out and branch out. And I think of the drum as it's like an ancient instrument that has a modern usage to bring us into the future. It's also very futuristic. And there's a saying by an author, he's kind of, the name is slipping my mind right now, but we pull from the past to bring to the future, to bring to the present, to heal the future, in the hopes that we will heal the future. And music has the greatest implication for that healing. And there's a continuum, there's these threads of connection. That's why sometimes we go back to the ancient archaeological record to see how long we've been doing this, and how that perhaps gave us that evolutionary advantage. And then we bring it through to the modern era, and then we look towards how that can open up and heal the future. And even the modern research that you and others are doing where we actually can look inside the brain, or we can measure the frequencies, we can measure the brain waves, right? And see what's happening, which can give us more information, like if we're tracking animal tracks and we're like, oh, it's going there, it's heading this way, let's follow that path. So we're following it, and we're bringing the different provisions from many different sources, from ancient and indigenous culture that has retained so much of this and is in danger of being lost, and part of just even recognizing and honoring the deep indigenous wisdom that has to do with musicality, shamanism, sacred ceremony, ritual, rites of passage, and then also having that fusion of the modern technology, because we are embedded in these technologies and they're kind of leading us into this unknown technological future, which there could be some real value for humanity in that. I feel like as long as we tether and recognize the value and the beauty and the depth of the indigeneity and how much they know naturally and through story and through keeping those streams of wisdom alive within their communities. So perhaps we can get a fusion happening.
Nice. You know, just about 2 weeks ago, I just got a really important message that I've been starting to tell people that is probably the most important in sound healing. And that is to really watch and be aware of all rhythms around you. And everything you've talking about, from circadian rhythms to walking. I mean, when I see some people walking down the street, I'm like, okay, what note is that? Do, 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 or bum, 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 right? And for frequencies are much harder for most people to discern. But rhythms are so accessible. I mean, everybody knows a fast rhythm versus a slow rhythm. It's like you see it. It's so obvious, right? And just to totally sink into every rhythm, which totally means the moon, the the different cycles of the ocean. I mean, every cycle, and I when you were saying about all the women with frame drums, my first thought is their cycle. It's really reverting back to their cycle, which is tied into the moon, which is tied into all the different cycles. And it's really all about returning to just a simple awareness of the rhythms in around you and in nature.
Absolutely. Thank you for that beautiful invocation, because I feel like even just hearing you speak about that in the way you did, which had a rhythmic quality to it, it's very soothing for the nervous system. And who amongst us couldn't use a little more soothing for the nervous system these days? So what you're saying about tuning into the rhythms around us, that's just one easy, free, low impact way of bringing more homeostasis, bringing more balance. And so, yeah, absolutely tuning into the rhythms, and then also making your own rhythm on the drum. And I love that the drum is something that people can really learn at any age or stage of life. And it's accessible. It can also get very, very complex, but there's this range that the drum can bring us. And
I had people just yesterday in a workshop, I had them feel their pulse and then everybody create a little rhythm song in their head. There's another thing that I just finished a book on relationships, and it's really so simple to really notice the tempo of you speaking. And we're so not aware of it. And when you're in even a discussion, to be able to notice that and simply slow it down.
That can definitely change the dynamic for people, just that. And the space between the words and the space between the notes, the slowing it down, coming into greater coherence rhythmically with each other. And sometimes also, playfully, working with different ways of being. Yeah, I think about when I share the drum and teach the drum, we're learning rhythmic time cycles. There's notations, there's different ways of approaching it, but one of the things I always love to encourage students right away is the intuitive drumming. And it's often very difficult for people to get into that because so many people in the West have been trained through like a school system where there's like a right way to do something and you really are supposed to, stay within the lines. And a lot of people feel like they don't have rhythm or they're not able to keep a steady beat. And I always go back to, well, you just stayed in rhythm, you're pretty much talking and walking in rhythm. Everybody has rhythm. But also I love like opening up the doorway and the gateways and like just giving permission, not that they need it from me, but sometimes people are just looking for permission. It's like, go for it. Try something. Make a cacophony. Have it be like a juxtaposition or awkward or strange or different. It's like, see what you discover and then do it twice and then you've got a rhythm, right? It's like if you make a mistake in drumming, that's the old adage, just do it again, repeat it, and then you've got yourself a rhythm. So there's a lot to explore about creative self-expression and rhythm, and then using it as a tool for calming the nervous system, recalibration, all the stuff about the cognitive enhancements, the cognitive calisthenics, we call it, because when we're working rhythmically and also just in any kind of music, as you know, recreational music making can be so vitalizing for neurological functioning. And also this other point that I find so fascinating is music and memory, right? With the people who are in memory care or might have some dementia and even into the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and things like that. There's all kinds of applications about rhythm and music. I had an experience a bit ago where we were with a beloved elder having a celebration and we started to put on like classical and vintage music and like just classic rock music. And no sooner did we put the classic rock that she was standing up and dancing. And this is a person who, was pretty much just bound to a chair and was in pretty deep forgetting. And
We were putting this guy on the sound table because we've got a sound table at the Dementia Center. And I said, let's do a test on the volume. He says, I was a deadhead, man. Crank it up. Crank it up. Oh my God. The 40 hertz thing that they're talking about for dementia, 40 hertz flashing is actually 240 beats per minute.
whoa.
So, and there's been studies that really fast rhythms are really the best for dementia now. There's a study I just read like 2 weeks ago because it's all about activating the brain and getting it really activated, except when they're really in advanced dementia, then they can't handle it sometimes.
Right.
A little
So,
too much.
creating that remedy for people. It's one of the things I'm also really interested in are the different applications for different demographics. It's like the kids, we have our first drum drum group for girls and we have 11 to 17-year-olds in that. And that's just a super fun class where they're learning the drum. Right now, my student body is from basically 11 to 70s, and there's different applications for the different demographics, but it's just so broad, right? The different demographics that can benefit from, I'll say drumming because that's my expertise, but also, of course, musicality. And I love this idea of the recreational music making, and how when we're doing it just for recreation and for fun, how that has certain effects on the brain. And we know also now from some of the modern research that really any instrument that a person takes up will start to light up the whole brain functioning and also get more connectivity through the different hemispheres of the brain, which I think that is really exciting because it just means more balance and more activation. And who knows what it means? I think the science is still out, the research is still out on how this affects people, but your work with the dementia, people that are experiencing dementia, and I think the whole category of people who need or would want something neurologically to either create more connectivity or for memorization and for brain optimization, and then also people who are in recovery, different kinds of addictions. I don't see drumming as like a cure-all. Again, it's an adjunct, it's a complementary tool in the medicine bag that can be utilized by people who are working with addictions, and some channeling some of those propensities, or all the allurements of the world, all the things that can be addicting, can channel some of that into drumming. And it's just so many different demographics of people who want stress reduction or ceremony, want to have ritual in their lives.
I just love the expansive perspective you have on this, from history to consciousness to everything. I really appreciate the work you've done.
Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure to be able to share and talk with someone such as yourself that has such a deep, rich knowledge. I just really honor your work and respect so much what you're doing, and I'm grateful to make this connection with you.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was a rhythm. Take care.
Until next time, thank you.